Welcome to American Camp. So we had the opportunity of being over at English Camp previously, and so this is where it all begins. American Camp is the U.S. Army Forces location, and that's because when the incident broke out for the Pig War boundary crisis, the Hudson Bay Company is located here on Cattle Point as well. Yeah, you might be able to see a small flagpole out in the distance where it's kind of was located. And so when the U.S. military arrived, they chose this as a strategic location because as we look out to the left, this is the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and then over our shoulder, even further all the way around, is you have Griffin Bay out in the distance. And so you've got, you know, this wonderful high up view of any direction a ship could come at you. And so it's an incredibly strategic defensive position, but when it went into a joint occupation, it was no longer about needing strategic defenses, and so what they were left with was this location that, while beautiful here on an August summer day, during the winter is battered with heavy rains and winds, and is quite a miserable place to be. And so what we see today is the remnants of that joint occupation, and a little bit of where the Hudson Bay Company was located.
Okay, let's talk about this first interpretive site. Where are we now?
This is the redoubt. The redoubt is simply an earthen defense structure. You don't see a lot of these in the West. This is a very unique feature to much of the entire Western United States. You'll find these more in Virginia and New York, particularly around the Revolutionary War period and some into the Civil War. And so, as you can see, it's built up in this particular section, and then there are kind of these little flat ramped areas that were built to take giant cannons, 32-pound naval guns, off of warships down on the water, brought up here to then point at British ships in the water as the peak of the crisis was coming around. And so this is a really unique story, the building of a redoubt for this event for that period of time.
What's that beautiful snow-capped mountain off there?
That's Mount Baker, over 14,000 feet. It's about as pretty as the sight gets on a summer day.
Very sweet.
And then another, I think, interesting story for a student to consider is Lieutenant Henry M. Roberts, who was an engineer. He actually was, he led the construction of the redoubt here, but he is most famous for developing Robert's Rules of Orders, of order, after his military period, and that is what the U.S. U.S. Congress and really any courtroom, they go by objection, and the procedures of order were developed by the same individual that was coordinating the building of this redoubt.
Very good. And here we have a plaque, and a plaque always indicates perhaps a larger storytelling opportunity. Honoring Henry Martin Robert, U.S. Engineer, 1859. Placed by Governor Isaac Stevens chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution and other chapters. So we're walking now from the redoubt towards American Camp. As you can see, it's a lovely view. We'll go over here and take a look at this interpretive sign.
This is perhaps my favorite photo. This is
not an artist's recreation. This is a contemporary photograph.
Yes, 1868. Just really clear use of daily life, and in the foreground you can see the cutting of all the trees. That, I mean, you've got to get wood from somewhere. And so when we get into historic sites like this, it's pretty common for folks to think that this is the setting, but really all the trees that we see around us are second growth or third growth from what was originally harvested here.
Here we come into American Camp. Was there a white picket fence like this?
There was.
Okay. Park Service doesn't just throw up stuff like that.
No, but some liberties have been taken over time. So when we look at this, when we look at the fence now, it's got the traditional point of a picket fence, but the fence at the time, or at least for most of its period, was actually just a flat board on top. So an artistic liberty whenever this was first installed was taken, but yes, there was a whitewashed fence around the camp.
Okay. And here's another interpretive sign with the artistic image of what it would have been like. Or is this English camp?
No, it's American camp.
Okay. I say that because the block house is so extremely similar.
Yes, yeah, like I said, at English camp, that's one of the few times the British took an American design. So where we are standing right now, we would be inside the blockhouse.
Okay. Very good. So what is there for students to interpret here? What kind of stops do we want in our mobile app?
So as far as something that's existing and tangible, we've got a really complicated story in this first house on the left, because this house belonged to Captain George Pickett, who later becomes infamous as a Confederate States general.
Traitor.
Traitor. Yep, no ifs, ands, traitor to the United States. And becomes infamous at the Battle of Gettysburg. And so while he's here, he's a loyal Union soldier, helps found AmericanCamp, though through kind of nefarious means of pinning Indians as the source of conflict when they really wanted to get in some beef with the British. And so we've got his house here to the left, that there's lots of opportunity to interpret Pickett through that tangible asset. And then to the right is where we just get into an officer's quarters that, I think is an opportunity for, it's a fairly common story, but it's a story that's not yet told here very well about, military officer life on the frontier. You'd find similar stories at Fort Spokane, closer to Spokane at Lake Roosevelt, Fort Steilacoom. There are a lot of stories like that, but that's not told here. And so we'd have officers down this way, but we also need stories told about everything that happened in between. So we were here for 12 years and nothing was happening. So we had schools and orderly houses and carpenter shops. What was done there? Why was it done? And really, I think some stories to help make the rest of this empty space feel like it was active.
Yeah, to make it sing. Absolutely. It's beautiful here, but it's also kind of deceptive with only the two buildings.
Yeah, there were 27 buildings here.
Okay. Before we leave George Pickett, of course, most of you know him through the Civil War, but I don't think that's an afterword to the story here. The story here is the establishment of the fort and things. Also, Pickett had a native wife. And did his native wife ever come here, though?
He had a couple of native wives.
I didn't know that.
While he was, first one passed away, and then he had another one who was Haida, which is now the inside passage of what is now Canada, and then southern Alaska along the islands. And so he had a Haida wife in Bellingham, and they had at least one child, if not more. But I don't think she ever made it out here.
Okay.
Before he departed for treasonous reasons.
There's a very good book called Peace Weavers by Candace Wellman, and also a subsequent book. Each of these are about Native women of the Northwest who are significant chapter by chapter, and there's one chapter called Mrs. Pickett. So there's a really good source out there for you, and fairly compact for anybody who wants to tell that story.
Please do.
All right. Well, let's take a look at these buildings. I take it we're not going to go in today.
Not today.
Okay, you guys have to come out here.
So as we approach, you'll see that there's a sharp aesthetic difference between the two. So what these two buildings have in common is that they were here during the military period, and they both saw life after the military period. When the military left in 1874, all the buildings were auctioned off. The one that was here on the left ended up being occupied by the Firth family. Lots of great photographs and stories to tell with the Firth family as well. Everything in front of this house was turned into an orchard and agricultural land with sharp picket fences and really neat post-military agricultural stories to tell in here. And so they had this house and they stripped the deck off, and it was occupied through the 1960s. And so it saw a lot of changes right here on site. But the house here to our right was bought, stripped down, and moved into Friday Harbor and reassembled, and it saw life there until 2010 when it was moved back here, and it saw use as a residential property and later commercial until it was identified as a historic property belonging here as an officer's quarters, and then it was eventually moved back here in 2010. So, but unfortunately, a decade has passed and money has not come back around to restore it to its historic fabric. Well, not so much fabric, but footprint and layout.
So this building looks very little, I take it, like it would have.
Correct. Mostly just a roof line in the rectangle.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it doesn't feel right. The windows and so on.
I mean, you go to the back of the building here and we look up and you just find painted plywood.
Okay.
It's really quite sad. But this is what happens to history when it's not funded.
That's not Park Service grade.
Not yet.
Okay. So this building was what? I'm sorry.
This was an officer's quarters.
Also.
And so when we look back here and you see these line of rocks, so there were another 2 officers' quarters back here, and each one of them had their own picket fence lining out their own backyard, because outhouses were back here, and then some of them had vegetable gardens of their own, and so this was, again, there was more historic fabric here that kind of delineated that gave a better picture of what life was operating in on a daily basis.
And if you tell some of these stories, you might begin students with reference to the physical environment. You see these stones scattered here, and then proceed from that.
Yeah, it's quite important that when you're working in a landscape with little historic fabric, we have to take what few tangibles that we have and begin to extrapolate a picture from there of what was, that we know was there.
What do we have in terms of images of the fort to use?
We've got about a dozen photos or so that include either close-ups of the hospital or of an officer's quarters in particular, or of the entire camp as a whole. And as we move forward, you'll see a giant field, but what is not seen is of great importance. In the distance, you'll see a small white flagpole, and that was kind of the center of operations for the Hudson Bay Company. They established something called the Bellevue Sheep Farm here in 1853, and so between 1853 and 1859, about 12 American homesteading families were squatters in the British eyes here across the island. And so as we look out here, there were giant sheep barns, probably about half a dozen quarters buildings, other farm buildings, outbuildings, outhouses. There was a small little town in the field in front of us, and there was miles and miles of fencing due to the livestock operation here. So the Hudson Bay Company established the Bellevue Sheep Farm. There were about 1,300 sheep to start with, and then they started bringing in thousands more and grazing them across different parts of the island. And this was all headquartered right here. And there are great photographs of it from the period of use, also into the 1900s when the buildings, though were not used by the Bellevue Sheep Farm, were remnants. There's still a lot of really great photographs there held in the digital archives, UW's archives, the park itself. And so you have, I think what's really interesting is AmericanCamp is being established as this exists. So within 50 yards of each other, you have the commercial arm of the British Empire, because it's a state-owned company that's, I mean, at this point 400 years old because it's still in existence, though not owned by the government. Right next to the U.S. military. Tensions were high. Guns were pointed. The U.S. Army is building an earthen defense fort to really trench in for a long period of time next to the commercial arm to the British government. And there, in this landscape, we miss the proximity that created the tension for really getting into each other's face. And so with the Bellevue Sheep Farm, there are a host of stories. One, just an overview of the farm itself that doesn't exist. You also have the Hudson Bay Company using their contact with Coast Salish Indians who were doing salmon salt drying racks here and understood the value of salmon, and so they started working with Coast Salish and then eventually quite quickly exploiting them for the fisheries. They hired natives, they hired native Hawaiians to be working the farms here. There was one black individual that worked here at the farm, so there's this cross-cultural workforce out here in a frontier that was, I mean, from the U.S. perspective, quite white, and there's a great amount of stories about power and exploitation and labor and to be found and developed here that are just not being told. So yeah, the Kanaka workforce, Kanaka was the term used amongst each other for Native Hawaiian, is a prominent story that needs to be told here. The Hudson Bay Company hired Cowichan Indians to build a road throughout the island that eventually became the military road that we talked about earlier. There's a lot to be told here.
You know, and one other story, keeping environmental history always in mind too is something people are interested in, that's important. And sheep as an environmental agent, you know, John Muir referred to sheep as hooved locusts for the changes they made to alpine environments. Wool was incredibly popular. It was cheaper than cotton for much of the 19th century. I'm not quite sure when they flip over. It was more common. Of course, it's warm when it's wet. It's more useful for rough living, and it was an important commodity. But there's a great environmental cost to it. And those sheep, you could tell the story here, but they're all throughout the islands. Hell, they're all throughout the American West by late 19th, early 20th century, and they have enormous consequences.
So
now this is available on Airbnb, right?
It is just $600 a night plus a cleaning fee.
Okay, very good.
This is the laundress quarters, and so this is where laundry was done for the post. All the laundresses had to be married, and so there was some really weird dynamics between needing to be married within 30 days if you were to stay here to do laundry. It was a poorly paid position. A lot of marriages occurred pretty quickly for stability out here on the frontier due to this kind of setup, because where else are you going to go, whether in the island or nearby? How does a single white woman get out here? How does she end up out here in 1859, 1860? A lot of times they didn't come out here single, but a husband dies along the way.
Oh, okay.
And find themselves newly single.
Okay.
And whether it was a homesteader on the island existing or otherwise, they generally didn't come single.
Okay.
And then another story that I would love for somebody to tell is, as we look out on the distance here, we see the water in the background, and in the mid-50s there was a giant 1950s there was a giant military training exercise called Operation Seawall, where the U.S. Navy brought large warships, a bunch of smaller vessels, and 12,000 soldiers, and stormed the beach here over the course of a week to run military game exercises on potential future beach invasions. And in the town of Friday Harbor, they bussed people out here over to Mount Finlayson and set up bleachers and just watch these military games. And so I would love for someone to tell this really unique story. Particularly, I do believe some photographs were taken by the local paper or the one in Anacortes. It's just a really unique story that to see on the landscape that otherwise anyone would miss.
I think newspapers.com would be a good source for that. It'd be easy enough to find information about it. Let's go and take a look at this sign really quickly here, because there's something here.
There is.
So this laundry is a place to talk about laundry, but also women's roles at military posts, and there's a good bit written about that.
Yeah, that's where the story's at. The
non-elite women. There's a couple of good books about Army officers' wives in the 19th century, but less known about laundresses.
So not quite the landscapes of the park, but the landscape of the park's future is we are currently in the middle of a large construction project to replace our old visitor center that was almost a 45-year-old double-wide trailer with an actual permanent facility. And so with that, we're trying to make some site improvements as well, including putting in like picnic trails, an amphitheater. This first half will be a demonstration area. There will be some a short rock wall to come around the side, and so that way cultural demonstrators and speakers can gather people in a central location. Then we have this trellis in front of us that's going to have, on the left-hand side, some swinging benches below them for some seating. On the right-hand side, we'll have some interpretive wayside panels, including a timeline of the region from time immemorial into the present. And so this is kind of the beginning of the future, including a new facility in the background.
Very good. So 45-year occupancy in a double-wide trailer. Any words about the role of budget austerity in a National Park Service career?
We are always told the sky is falling, but yet we keep moving forward and new people keep getting hired. I think everyone romanticizes the days of the past and vilifies the present. We always want budgets to be bigger, but we always seem to have enough to hire the people we need and get the work done. So I recommend a career at the Park Service.
The thing about romanticizing the past and vilifying the present, boy, that's not just the Park Service, is it?
That's a people story.
Yeah, that's a public history story. Very good. So here's the new building going in, and how close is it?
It'll be to completion on October 12th. That'll be, beneath our feet will be paved, and all of the sidewalks will go in. So it's coming around the corner here, about 6 weeks.
Well, it'll be ready for business when there's a vaccine.
Yes, we look forward to welcoming people wide open. And to our left here is the other monument to match the one at English Camp, placed in 1904.
Up on a pallet, you don't see that every day.
Currently on a pallet.
So just like the other one, it says AmericanCamp on one side. And then let's go around in the same order I did at English Camp. So first officer in charge was Captain Geo, a very unusual name. Well, of course, that's George E. Pickett of the 9th U.S. Infantry before he betrayed his country. As arbitrator, this is, I think, identical to the other one.
Yes.
William I, Emperor of Germany, decided the San Juan case. You know all about that from your readings. And erected October 21, 1904 by the Washington University State Historical Society. That's a really, both State Historical and the Washington University, I'm not quite sure what those things are doing together in 1904, but I'm pretty sure this is the organization that becomes the Washington State Historical Society. They are currently trying to do a statewide inventory of all historical markers put up by the State Historical Society. At some point they lost track. So they're trying to find them all in every corner of the state and which ones are there, so to speak. So I'm going to make sure they know about this.